Mr. Shapiro, your name has come up a few times. Before today, I didn't know who you were. Before I heard from Mr. Morlock. Nice to meet you. And
nice to meet you as well.
The floor is yours. And I would like just to ask, you don't have to because this is free speech time, the subject matter is combating hate while protecting the Constitution. And if you have a couple minutes worth of ideas on that, that would be great. If you'd rather not talk on that, that's okay too.
Oh no, I'm perfectly happy to talk on that.
Thank you.
I appreciate the 120 seconds. So, your job obviously here at the legislature is to ensure that our freedom of expression is maintained, that our First Amendment rights are maintained. And what that means first and foremost, in my experiences on college campuses, is that the heckler's veto must be stopped. So I was at Cal State Los Angeles in February 2016, and there was almost a riot there, and the police were not allowed to do their jobs, and students were physically assaulted in the crowd. It is the job of this legislature to ensure that police can do their jobs. And when they do their jobs, and they're allowed to do that at places like UC Berkeley, everything goes fine. And I'd like to make a point here about UC Berkeley. The reason it cost $600,000 to bring me to UC Berkeley was not because of me. Okay, everybody keeps suggesting that it was because I was coming. I'm so controversial and so terrible. I came exactly 1 year before, and it cost this many dollars. It cost $0 for security at UC Berkeley. The reason it cost $600,000 at UC Berkeley is because Antifa and violent groups had decided that Berkeley was their domain, and they were going to be able to run roughshod over law enforcement there. And this does bring up one final point that I want to make in the long period of time that I have to discuss, and that is the problem with a legislative body such as yours trying to draw lines specifically about what hate speech constitutes. Because the fact is that one of the reasons groups like Antifa show up is not because they know who I am, it's because they have been told by people that I am promulgating hate speech, which is utterly false and utterly untrue. There are people who say vile things and with whom I disagree. Among them, people like Milo Yiannopoulos, who sent me a picture of a black baby on the day of my child's birth because I wasn't sufficiently standing up for the white population, supposedly. But that does not mean that the legislature gets to decide what hate speech is. I've been labeled the promulgator of hate speech when I was the #1 target of hate speech according to the ADL among the journalistic community in 2016. So let me suggest that as a legislature, your chief job is to ensure that my taxpayer dollars in this state go toward making sure that people like me and people with whom I disagree get to speak in places like college campuses, and not toward regulating what speech you find good and what speech you find bad. It's a really dangerous business, and there's speech I don't like, there's speech you don't like, but if we can't agree that there's a difference between speech and violence, we're not going to be able to have a free state, let alone a free country. Thanks.
Thank you. Much appreciated. I think we all agree with you.
Well, that'd be nice.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Next witness, if you give us...
Decided to come here and testify today.
Well, I mean, I was asked by legislative Republicans to come here. They wanted to actually have me on one of the panels, but Democrats wouldn't allow that sort of thing because that might be too much free speech. So we have to ensure that only people on the left get to talk, and members of law enforcement. So I was glad to hear from all those people, but it would have been nice if they would have allowed one person from the right to actually talk for more than 120 seconds. That doesn't seem like a particularly fair division of time.
You mentioned heckler's veto. Can you embellish on that?
Sure.
And why you wanted to bring that up to the council?
So one of the big ways that free speech has been curbed by the left is by people in administrative positions, people who are elected officials and law enforcement officials, who basically allow groups like Antifa to drive the cost of doing business so high that they then turn around and cancel events. So what they say is, it's going to cost $1 million to bring Shapiro in, let's just cancel the event, it costs too much money, we can't do it. And so what they're essentially allowing is people who are the most violent to dictate who gets to speak and who doesn't, which is precisely the opposite of what should be happening. That's why I was making the point. It's not me. I'm not the one who's driving the cost up. It's these violent groups. And when you say to the violent groups, well, what can we do to lower the cost? The violent groups are immediately going to move by increasing the cost, right? They're going to get violent, they're going to require lots of law enforcement, and then they shut down the city. So that has to stop, because otherwise, basically, all you have is an inside-outside game with elected Democrats working with outside agitators in order to prevent free speech from occurring.
What are your ideas to stop them?
You need to allow the police to do their damn jobs. It's really not difficult. It's not difficult. At Berkeley, they had the police. They're doing their jobs. If they'd had the police allowed them to do their jobs in February, none of this would have happened. Okay, the fact is that they've been telling the police for years in places like Berkeley that they can't use pepper spray against violent protesters, that they have to be very careful about how they appear in terms of arresting people. When I was at Cal State LA, they were telling the police apparently that they were supposed to stand down rather than arresting students. The more you do that, the more violence you're going to get on these campuses, just as you would anywhere else in the world. When you say violence is okay, violence increases.
What are your thoughts about some of the lawmakers asking if they can tax the taxpayers to pay for these issues that happen on campus?
Well, I mean, so there were a couple of things that they were suggesting. One is they were saying, can we tax the speakers for people coming on campus, which is just asinine. I mean, the answer is no, you can't do that, right? It's your job to provide a free speech forum, and it is my job to come if I'm invited. Second, the taxpayers didn't pay for me to come to Berkeley. The taxpayers paid for law enforcement to provide security against violent people. I'm not the one smashing ATMs. And as far as the idea that the taxpayers should be covering the cost of all of this, again, the cost would be a lot lower if we just allowed the police to do their jobs. And for all the people, it's amazing to me, all these Democrats in the state legislature are suddenly concerned about cost containment. I mean, what's the deal with that? I mean, we have trillions of dollars of debt in this state. They can't contain a cost if they're like dependent on it, but suddenly they decide to draw the fiscal hard line when it comes to protection of free speech.
Do you think that you're being shut down?
Well, I mean, I wasn't shut down at Berkeley. I think there's a danger that I would be shut down if some of the Democrats in this legislature had their way. They would hide behind things like time, place, and manner restrictions or behind the heckler's veto. But as long as the police are allowed to do their job, I'm happy to come and talk to any crowd, whatever color, whatever viewpoint.
Anything else you'd like to add? I haven't asked.
The only thing that I would add is just that this attempt by some folks on the left to conflate speech they don't like with hate speech and then suggest that there are legislative remedies is a violation of First Amendment ideals, and legislation that actually pushed that would be a violation of the First Amendment itself.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
It was nice to meet you.
You too. Yeah. Hey, how's it going? Hey, nice to meet you.
I can wait for
So I believe there's a mic at the top over here, so happy to take questions. If it doesn't look like there are going to be a lot of people who disagree, but if you do disagree, I have a standing rule. Oh, good, okay, good. If I have a standing rule at any speech that I give, which is that if you disagree, you get to go first.
Hi, Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
Huge fan. I actually agree.
So far, the disagreement is going well.
Sorry about that. But this is actually a question in response to comments that you've made in the past. Specifically, I believe it was, if there is a system of oppression,
yes,
then point to it and we'll fight it together.
Yes.
I was challenged by, I was working at a summer camp, and I was challenged by members who are of the left. They believe that there are many systems of oppression, but the main one they pointed to was the prison system. Mm-hmm. And that mainly involved the 13th Amendment, specifically something about a clause that if
is the involuntary servitude?
I'm sorry if I'm not completely educated.
It's totally fine, yeah. The 13th Amendment bans slavery and involuntary servitude.
I know, it's really bad. But they mainly pointed to a Netflix documentary called 13th. Mm-hmm. Featuring Van Jones, and I believe, yeah, I know. Even like I like
Van, but he's a comic.
Nixon campaign advisors and other campaign advisors of previous presidents. So I'd like to know what do you think about the prison system in terms of how it is a system of oppression?
It is not a system of oppression to put criminals in prison. So my view of the criminal justice system is that if you commit a crime, you should go to jail. And there's a very easy way to avoid jail, and it's called not committing crimes. So there's a lot of talk in the United States about the bias in the criminal justice system. There's only one problem with this idea, which is that the crime reports match up entirely with crime arrests, meaning that the number of crime reports that are received by the cops match up by race with the number of arrests they make. So it's not like you've got an enormous number of white people calling the cops on white people, and then the police just ignore it, and 0 black people calling the cops on black people, and the police just go and pick up every black person they can find. The crime rate reports are entirely consistent. Okay, and the talk about how more blacks than whites are being arrested on the basis of certain crimes. Well, yeah, right. The idea is that it's disproportionate. Well, yes, because there's a disproportionate share of crime that's being committed by black people. I mean, that is not a racial comment. That is a statistical comment. It has nothing to do with the color of their skin. It has to do with the fact that there are poverty cultures that exist in certain inner cities in the United States that generate enormous levels of crime, and that single motherhood, which is now at 70% in the black community, is highly linked to crime rates. Again, that's true for white people also. Single motherhood is deeply linked to crime rates in the white community as well. But this idea that cops are just out there trying to randomly shoot black people and arrest black people is just a bunch of crap. And this nonsense where the example that they like to use, their favorite example, just to debunk their favorite one, is the idea that in the United States, an ounce of crack cocaine gets you a longer sentence than an ounce of powder cocaine.
I was about to mention the war on drugs.
Yeah, so let me be clear about my view on the war on drugs. I'm libertarian on drugs. So I'm for decriminalization of marijuana, and so long as drugs are not actually... and so long as drugs are not actively creating so long as drugs are not creating externalities, meaning you take a drug like PCP and then you go murder somebody, then I don't see where it's the government's business whether you drink or do drugs. All that said, drugs deeply, deeply annoy me from a societal and moral point of view. But when it comes to crack cocaine and powder cocaine, the reason that they are different sentences is because there were a bunch of black legislators in the 1980s who were sick of watching crack ravage their communities and push for longer sentences for crack cocaine. Crack cocaine is easier to distribute, it is more concentrated in form, and here is the best proof that there is no racial bias. You know it's another substance that gets exactly the same sentence for exactly the same amount. Crystal meth. White people get arrested for crystal meth. And the vast majority of people who are arrested for distribution of crystal meth are white. And that does not seem, that would be a perfect case where you would expect if there was bias in the criminal justice system, ooh, they're white because it's crystal meth, they get less time. They don't.
Thank you.
Great.
Hi, Mr. Shapiro. I'd just like to say it's an honor to be even asking you a question. This past year, me and a few friends with inspiration from you founded a conservative campus group at our university, UTM. And I wanted to say thank you, firstly, for the inspiration, and also, what do you think should be our role on the campus, and what should be our main objectives? Obviously, free speech, but after free speech.
So, I mean, there are a number of things that you can do on campus. First of all, thank you for being the activist on campus. I come and I go and I make speeches, but after I leave, you're the one on the ground who has to do the work. So the first thing that I recommend to everybody is, again, a piece of advice that I got from Andrew Breitbart, and that is, if you have a smartphone, you are now a journalist. Okay, if you have a smartphone and it has a camera on it, it is your job to expose some of the bad things that are going on your campus. So if you see extreme things that professors are saying, particularly at a public campus, then get me the information, email me at bshapiro@dailywire.com, and we'll cover it. We have several writers who are going to Canadian universities right now, actually. We actually cover Canadian universities relatively in depth from time to time at Daily Wire. So you're a journalist now because no one else is going to cover it. You're the only person on campus who's there to see it. And sunlight is the best disinfectant. As far as other things you can do, obviously trying to take over student government would be great. I know that BDS has become a major issue on a lot of campuses and one that I'm passionate about. I think that fighting BDS is worthwhile. And the best way to fight BDS is not to do the sort of typical Israel defense stuff where you talk about how wonderful Israel is and look, we have girls in bikinis and beaches. And no, the best way to fight BDS is to say this is Jew hatred pure and simple. The only reason that you're targeting the state of Israel is because you hate Jews. Because if you really cared about the human rights violations, you'd be talking about targeting Iran or the Palestinians or the Saudis or the Yemenis.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Ben. My name is Rahan. I recently was tasked to be a health policy analyst for the Progressive Conservative Party in regards to health policy. I was wondering if you'd be willing to take a health policy question.
Sure.
So I define myself as a classical liberal. I believe in smaller government. I believe in individual freedom and personal responsibility. When I'm researching health issues, I noticed that a single-payer healthcare system is much more efficient than privatized systems. For example, so when I've been researching health policy issues, I've noticed that single-payer systems, such as, for example, in Canada, in countries like the UK, in Sweden, that they actually cost less, they provide greater access. My question is, how could we implement free market principles into a healthcare system? Do we have to go down the route that the US has gone, where we have a system where the administrative costs of the US healthcare system are 346% more than the Canadian healthcare system?
No. I mean, there's an enormous number of regulations in place in the United States that drive those costs up. So to understand the roots of the American healthcare system, you have to understand that health insurance did not used to be linked to employment. So the vast majority of people in the United States get their health insurance through their employer. Their employer actually buys their health insurance for them. That was because the federal government during World War II and a little bit after actually regulated wages. So that meant that employers who wanted to give their employees raises couldn't give them more money, so instead they gave them health insurance. And then the government began incentivizing employers to do this. So what that meant is there's actually a pretty wide gap in the United States between people who are happy with their health insurance, namely people who are employed, and people who are not employed and have to buy in the individual markets. Obamacare tried to kind of create a mandate that was going to supposedly drive healthy people to buy, and that would take care of the sick people. But the problem is that number one, the mandate was not high enough if you're going to do that. And number two, it's violative of basic rights to force people to buy something that they don't want to buy. So the best way to think about healthcare is that there are three things you can look for in any healthcare system. There's universality, there's affordability, and there's quality. Right? You can have two of those three, but not all three. There's no way to have all three. You can't have affordability and universality and quality. So in the United States, the 5-year cancer survival rate is a lot higher than it is in Canada or in Sweden or in Denmark. The vast majority of medical patents still come out of the United States. And that's because of a profit-based system. So how do you get all that and then also get low cost? Well, it's pretty easy, actually, to get low cost, but you're not going to get universality. There's still going to always be this group of people who don't think ahead enough, and this is really the problem with the healthcare system. There's a group of people who don't think ahead enough to actually buy healthcare when they are young and healthy. They wait until they're old, and then they have a pre-existing condition, and they can't get healthcare because insurance companies insure against risk. They don't give you money for a risk that has already materialized. So, my basic answer is that if you were to deregulate the healthcare system almost entirely in the United States, give tax credits for the individual provision of healthcare as opposed to through your employer, and then get rid of the restrictions about not selling insurance across state lines, allow people to sell all types of insurance plans, then just like in every other area of capitalism, you would see an increase in quality and a decrease in price. Because this happens with every other product. Treating healthcare as a right and not a product has actually driven up price and driven down quality, as opposed to treating it as a product.
When we talk about how, for example, you said there are 3 pillars: affordability, accessibility, and quality. One question I had is about collective bargaining. In a single-payer system, for example, drugs, whether it be pharmaceuticals, whether it be healthcare services, they can be collectively bargained. The issue that I'm seeing with systems that don't have that is that what ends up happening is that individuals now buy health insurance from a corporation. Those corporations are now competing with each other. This removes any incentive for collective bargaining. And the fact of the matter is that when individuals are purchasing healthcare services individually, they simply cannot get the same price that other countries who are purchasing collectively, such as Canada, and we're seeing a huge problem in the United States.
Yeah, for sure. And this is one of the problems with this is a deeper problem in the United States and in Western civilization generally, is the lack of social institutions outside government. So it used to be that you would get your insurance basically through your church group or through your synagogue group. You'd collectively bargain with the people in your community, and then you would go to, and they still have these co-ops in the United States, and you collectively bargain with the insurance companies. Again, there's 2 things that you're trying to do. One is provide for the sick and elderly, and the second is not to create the moral hazard of not encouraging people who are young to go out and buy. So when you have these government fallback positions, what you actually end up doing is creating a subsidy for the insurance companies that end up driving the prices up. And then if you're in the private sector, then you're still paying those high prices, and you have to collectively bargain in order to drive them back down. It's really complicated and really heavily regulated, and I fail to see, other than the sort of general argument that you don't want to see sick people uninsured, which is a fine argument, but calls for charity, not necessarily government intervention. Other than that argument, I fail to see how healthcare is not a product.